Barstool Sports is one of the most successful media companies that has, managed to make it through every single pivot and transition within the media landscape. And they're not seen as a political entity. But there is a Wikipedia page called Barstool Sports Conservatism that I think all of you should read if you haven't, because it's real. They're talking about sports, they're talking about music, they're talking about Love Island and entertainment, but they're talking about all of it from a very conservative point of view. They're imbuing their conservative ideology into all of their pop culture content, and I think that's where the left is really struggling. And that's what our goal with Mutuals has been since we came up with this idea 2 years ago, is to build a Barstool Sports of the left. And something we struggle to convince donors of is how that's actually a really important political tool. Even if we're not talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, which, love her, but even if we're not talking about that, there's still a lot of political efficacy in talking about pop culture issues from a very liberal perspective and from a liberal lens. I've seen that in my own content. When I talk about ballerina farms, I'm not hashtagging Joe Biden, I'm not hashtagging the Democrats, I'm talking about ballerina farms. That video on my personal account got over 3 million views. And that was talking about, the pipeline. I wasn't talking about electoral politics, but that's having an impact on someone who is probably not consuming any kind of political news outside of that. And that's the playing field that Democrats really need to be in. And that's kind of our goal with Mutuals and with our show Gaydar, is we can hashtag Sabrina Carpenter, we should hashtag Troye Sivan, all the people we're talking about in our video. And in the middle of that video, we'll talk about the Supreme Court for one question, or we'll talk about, Ron DeSantis and the Don't Say Gay bill for a second question. But we're getting to the For You pages of people who are only consuming pop culture content. And I think that's a place where we really lose people to the right. Ben Shapiro isn't talking about the ins and outs of Congress. Ben Shapiro is talking about Barbie. And we should be talking about Barbie too.
I think one big context here that I think the previous panel talked a little bit about are the platforms themselves. I'm wondering about what are your thoughts in terms of the lowest hanging fruit or biggest opportunities in terms of platforms for reaching some of these people that maybe wouldn't be consuming mainstream news, or maybe they're left behind. Particularly, whether it's YouTube, Substack, TikTok, or whatever. Maybe Faiz, if you want to go first.
YouTube is obviously the biggest streaming platform. There's a lot of conversation about Netflix, and it's not. It's YouTube. And as more and more people get off cable and move to YouTube TV, I think it will have a huge opportunity. And we're on, More Perfect Unions on Instagram and TikTok and Substack and all of them. And one of the reasons I loved, and I think YouTube has a great gateway to more and more growth for us, and hopefully for a progressive community, is that your behavior when you go to YouTube is different than your behavior elsewhere. Amelia would be a great example for me here. So she's watching, a movie, and she's scrolling TikTok and she's scrolling Instagram.
True.
But if you're not going to watch that movie and try to watch the YouTube, you're picking one or the other, and think about your behavior when you watch or listen to a podcast. It's similar, right? You went there as a destination to get information to consume. That's the similar with YouTube, right? You saw it in visual form, but you went there as a destination. You weren't necessarily going da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And I think that opportunity, when you can clutch people in that direction, whether it is a podcast or YouTube or something that has depth to it, now you can start working on the persuasion stuff, right? Now you can start to hopefully, talk to some folks about challenging their prior assumptions, giving them some new information, but it's harder to do that with just a scroll. So that's kind of a more strategic investment direction that I would argue for.
Judd, I'm curious about your take, because you've built just like a singularly massive newsletter audience, I think close to 400,000 subscribers at this point. What do you think folks are missing in terms of sort of the newsletter space?
I mean, I think that the benefit of newsletters is that it's based on email. And, one of my fundamental belief, and I think that more people need to understand this, is that all of the platforms are working against the progressive movement, and they're antagonistic to progressive politics. It's been that way for some time. Obviously, Twitter or X is just, that's very self-evident, but all of the meta properties are suppressing all political news because it does not make them as much money. Or I don't know what their reason is. I think that's probably it. But that's actually beneficial to the right, because if you look, the lowest information voters are the ones that are voting more Republican. So if you suppress as much political news as possible, you're going to benefit the Republican side. I think Faiz is right about video content. I just don't know if I would trust that YouTube is going to be helpful. I think over time, they all are helpful until they're not helpful. So I think it's just important to have a strategy that doesn't depend on any of the platforms. Fundamentally, I think the purpose of this content should be to take on powerful entities and to be antagonistic towards them. And so if you are reliant on an algorithm controlled by a large corporation, it probably will come back to bite you in the end. So circling back around, email is not completely separate from that, but it's the closest thing that we have to it. So the way I view the platforms is I'm trying to just pull people from whatever platform I can for as much time as I can and get them into the email space so that I can then have a direct connection to them that's not reliant on an algorithm. So since the election, that's been blue sky. That's been growing. I don't know how long that will last, but as long as it's around, I'll continue to use it. And then we'll see what the next thing is. But I just think that, and this is, I'm not immune to this. I kind of fell in love with sort of the floods of traffic that you used to get from Facebook and other things, but it never lasts. So that would be my approach to platforms, is you can just be opportunistic with them, but you shouldn't view any of them as like a long-term strategy.
And you guys both know, because I don't know if everyone realizes this, but both Faiz and Judd were both like OG Think Progress staffers, founders.
As was Tanya.
As was Tanya. If anyone remembers Think Progress from like 2010 or
The only
2005,
progressive media we had.
it was like, yeah, our big thing. And I remember like clicking on links on my Facebook page in college of Think Progress articles. And now Facebook does not really let you promote links anymore. Tara, yeah, what are your thoughts on platforms?
I want to build on that because I think that's a really important point, and it's also why we need to invest much more heavily in creators, like the folks that were on the last panel, and so many others, and especially people that don't necessarily talk about politics very often or at all, because they're the ones who are building direct relationships, and hopefully they also are or can be persuaded to start to translate and migrate those relationships into email and SMS and other personal information so they can maintain that communication and those relationships with the audiences they build off of the platforms.